Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today is Friday, so it's Self-Improvement Friday. And always delighted to have John present all these incredible topics. And today is one of my special favorites. So over to you, John.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you. Welcome everybody. I'm delighted for everybody to spend their Friday evening learning and discussing ideas. I don't think there is a better pastime. And as today's topic, it's a little bit different. Typically I use like an entire discussion around a body of work or a piece of fiction or a story or an article or something like this. Today, it's a little bit more like intellectually free flowing in terms of a playground. There's gonna be a lot of ambiguity here. There's gonna be a lot of room for interpretation. And the two main like background contextual, I guess, baselines that I want to like explore off of are, one is gonna be a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson. It's in his essay, Self-Reliance. And another is actually going to be an image. Okay, the image was actually portrayed in the meetup page itself. I'm going to have Shrikant send this image that we're going to talk about in chat so everybody can view it there. I'm not sure the logistics if you have to click on it manually, but I'm sure he'll handle that side of that. So for the introduction, I'm going to read the quote and then we're going to explore all of the implications and like how it relates to this picture and all the implications off of the picture, and etc. So this quote is as follows. There is a time in every man's education when he arrives at the conviction that envy is ignorance, imitation is suicide, that he must take for himself, for better, for worse, as his portion, that though the wide universe is full of good, no kernel of nourishing corn can come to him, but through his toil bestowed on that lot of ground which is given to him to till. So Emerson is a particularly profound writer. He's one of the most widely quoted authors that I've ever known of or ever heard of. And this is what actually led me to dive into his text in itself. I always heard of Emerson. I always heard people quoting him, my favorite thinkers, my favorite writers, my favorite philosophers quoting him. And then I said, okay, let me look to the source. And it's very profound. There's a lot of depth to a lot of his lines. They're deceptively simplistic, but they're very thought-provoking. So we're going to go through this, I guess, line by line, and I want to look at the implications that I was able to extract from here. So first of all, the first line, there's a time in every man's education. So there is a time, meaning as it's an inevitable threshold, right? There is a time you are going to pass this threshold predicated on every man's education. Now, if you look at the linguistics behind the word education, it's actually very interesting. Mark Twain is famous for saying, don't let schooling interfere with your education. So there's a discrepancy between traditional styles of learning, I guess you would say, or indoctrination, as other people might say, where schooling would be, and education. So if you look at education, the root word is educo, E-D-U-C-O, and that means to draw out, to develop from within. So in other words, I've heard the notion that several scholars, several philosophers say the only real knowledge is like self-taught knowledge, like knowledge that you've experienced firsthand. This is the philosophy behind empiricism, or like information that you were actually curious about, you went out to sacrifice for, you went out to go and invest in, and then you extract those principles on your own. So when you do that, you arrive at this conviction that Emerson is talking about. Envy is ignorance. Imitation is suicide. So envy is ignorance. That's a little bit of a conundrum there. What does that mean? What are we ignorant of? If we are envious of another person, I would say, let's say I'm envious of somebody toward their particular realm of results. And I would say envy would be ignorance because this is actually in a preceding paragraph. You have contextual material. Emerson says, in every work of genius, we recognize our own rejected thoughts. So again, in every work of genius, we recognize our own rejected thoughts. What does that mean? So bringing that into envy is ignorance. I can look at that and conclude that, let's say somebody has a successful business or a successful marriage or a very fulfilling relationship, and I'm envious of that. What I'm ignorant of, in Emerson's words, I would say is, you could say that is a work of genius or a work of achievement or a work of accomplishment. I recognize my own rejected thoughts. So in other words, I had the thought forms, I had the ideas, the seeds, the inclinations, the urges, the hunches of intuition that might have led me to that fulfilled result of that marriage, of that career, of that income level, of that physique, whatever aspect I'm looking for. I had the seed that might have led me there, but I rejected it. I rejected it out of fear. I rejected it out of being uncomfortable. I rejected it out of, I didn't have enough information. Whatever excuse that I justified it with, I rejected it. And I think that's what he means when he says envy is ignorance. If I'm envious of somebody, I'm ignorant of the fact that I actually had the opportunity to have those results. More so, you look at this even deeper, I think envy is you can look at it as somewhat illusory, because you're not in competition with anybody but yourself, but your past self, because every single individual on the planet has their own set of experiences, of beliefs, of input, of conditioning, of parental upbringing, of schooling, of education, of genetic abilities, of talents, weaknesses, strengths. You guys understand where I'm going with this. Everybody can be separated to the realm of the individual. They are a one of one. Therefore, for me to like compete with somebody, it doesn't make any sense, because we're not playing the same game, if you will. So we're not in the same race, because I'm on my own path. So if you look at this, it's kind of reassuring, because you can never be ahead or behind anybody in life, because they're simply on different paths or on different trajectories. You don't have the same experiences and beliefs and all those variables as anybody in the world except yourself. So the only logical conclusion to do in terms of growth is to be better than who you were yesterday. Because who you were yesterday, there you have an overlap of 99.9% variables. You have that 0.01% in like the experiences or the insights or the meditations of the past 24 hours, which probably isn't much given the whole scope of your life, right? So you versus you yesterday, 99.9% similar. Therefore, you should compete with that individual. So I also think that is a deeper interpretation of envy is ignorance, because you're not playing the same game as anybody else, right? And then the concluding part, I'm just going to lump this into one whole interpretation. He says, envy is ignorance, imitation is suicide. He realizes that he must take for himself, for better or for worse, as his portion. That though the wide universe is full of good, no kernel of nourishing corn can come to him, but through which his toil bestowed on the lot of ground which is given unto him to till. So in short, I guess that's more of a poetic way to say you reap what you sow, right? You earn all the results that are contingent upon your efforts. Another way to say it can be like the strength of the effort is the measure of the result, right? You always get out of life whatever you put in. It's a formula, okay? I think it's a really, really healthy way to look at this. So when I was reading this quote, I remember in my recent memory, I saw an image, and I'm going to actually have Shrikant post that image in the chat, and I would like a few verbal confirmations if people can see the image or not, because I'm on mobile, I'm not able to access it.
I have posted it. Just if you can see it, just type in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, you guys should just see an image in chat. It's just an image of a figure putting a mask on his face.
It's called full size. Yes. Okay.
Okay.
People
cool, guys.
See it, yeah.
Cool. You can see it. So yeah, click on that. We're gonna do a little bit of an interpretation for the rest of the discussion, centered off that and Emerson's words. You might have to download it. Yeah, maybe. Okay. So when I was reading Emerson's lines, I thought of the fact of imitation. The first realization, the first conviction that Emerson says we arrive at in education, in our intellectual development and journey, imitation is suicide. So what does that mean? And you can look at this as symbolically represented in this image here. This individual is putting a mask on. Why? He is trying to imitate either somebody or something or an expectation. He's trying to appear a certain way that is a discrepancy between who he really is and what he wants to be shown as. If you guys don't see it, it's in the chat. It's also on the meetup page if you guys have access to that. So it's an image of an individual putting a mask on his face. So I want to do now an analysis of this, given Emerson's words. Okay, so the main, I guess, interpretation here is imitation is suicide. So why would putting on a mask be, I guess, pleasant? Because if you look at the individual's countenance, his facial expression, he seems like he's pleasant. He seems like it's a pleasant action to be putting this mask on, to appear a certain way and not be a certain way, to be more concerned with having than being. And first of all, I would say it's based off of the desire for social validation, which is perfectly justified. There's a book called Social by Matthew Lieberman. And in it, he talks about the subtext of that book is how our brains are wired to connect. And in that book, he talks about a lot of things. namely like how our evolutionarily, it was evolutionarily advantageous to conform, in short. So we grew up in tribes of about 100 to 120 people, which was Dunbar's number. And if we in any way were a nonconformist, we went against the tribe, we went against the dominant narrative, we went against social acceptance, we were exiled. And of course, exile at that time meant death. So it was actually an evolutionary advantage to conform, to be like everybody else around you. Okay, so social validation, you can argue, is one of the prime motivating desires in life, right? That's you can say that with perfect merit. Okay, social validation was a prime motivating variables. So there's two ways you can approach this end, right? There's nothing inherently wrong or benevolent with social validation. I would say it's necessary, but you can do this in one of two ways. You can do this in terms of expedience. So in terms of like what is immediate. So like in this case, wearing a mask, presenting yourself like you are something else from what you appear to be for validation. But here's the thing, this is only the short-term validation. And there's plenty of pros and cons to this, okay? Short-term, I would say you get affirmation, you get praise, you get attention. People, applaud you for having this mask, for appearing this way, even though it's surface level. The cons, I would say, it is exactly that. It's surface level. It is shallow. It's meretricious. It looks good on the surface, but it's lacking any depth. If people like poke and inquire at this mask or this character you're portraying yourself as, you would be stuck. You'd be stuck in a hole. You don't really have to, you wouldn't really be able to elucidate the philosophy behind that appearance. So I'd say that was the con of that. And furthermore, you're only going to have attention that's very transitory. So the catering to the mass mob would only get you attention for that short-lived duration of time. It's transitory until they look at somebody else with a new mask, with something shinier, with something newer that elicits more attention. And then what happens? You're abandoned. You're forgotten about. So the other way to social validation and praise, I would say, is like taking a longer-term approach. And this is, if anybody was here last week, we talked about identification with attributes versus identification with forms. Somebody who's identified with the attributes, in other words, they're more concerned with being a certain way than appearing a certain way. They would have long-term validation and they would have long-term praise. Now, the con to that, the downside is obviously you might get ignored. You might just only be working with your head down by yourself. You might even be viewed at and criticized by the mass mob. And in this same book, Self-Reliance, Emerson actually says, for nonconformity, the world whips you with its displeasure. I always thought that was a very beautiful quote. Following that, he says, to be great is to be misunderstood. So going back to the book by Matthew Lieberman called Social, he actually says the area of the brain that processes social pain, in other words, being embarrassed, being exploited, etc., or feeling humiliated, being ashamed, it's processed in the same part of the brain as physical pain is. So there's a actual biological link between being embarrassed or being exiled from the group. Like you're going against biology when you're a nonconformist, in short. So it's difficult. It's understandable how it's at least surface level appealing to put this mask on to imitate something that we are not. But again, in Emerson's words, this is suicide because it is a complete waste of the actual individual that we are. So I guess like a polarization, a contrast, if you choose validation now, it's short-lived, it's transitory, it's hollow, it's shallow, it's not really that fulfilling. You could make the neurological argument. This is like the release of dopamine. You get immediate burst, you get immediate affirmation. And on the contrary, like if you delay this praise, if you delay this gratification, or you can look at it a different way. If you only look at your validation in terms of, superimposing importance over the mass validation, this takes a little bit of time, okay? You have to actually be somebody of achievement or somebody of quality or somebody of coherent values and actions. This takes time, okay? So but the thing is that I would say that's the only downside. It takes time. Or you might be criticized by the mass mob, but that's okay if you understand your principles and your ideals, because long-term, this praise, this affirmation, this attention is a lot more rewarding, okay? And a simple discrepancy can be something like, if you look at compliments in each way. So let's say compliments in terms of like wearing a mask or portraying yourself only to fabricate or contrive an appearance. The best quality compliment you can receive is like, you look nice today, maybe, or like, you appear nice. It's like, yeah, that feels kind of good. It might release dopamine, but like in an hour, you're going to forget about it. Whereas if you have somebody who says to you, on the other half of the spectrum, if you delay this gratification, if you cultivate your attributes and you cultivate your inherent colors and idiosyncrasies, that's the equivalent of somebody complimenting you and saying, I'm proud of the person you've become. Okay. That might take a year to earn from somebody to say that to you, but I guarantee you'll remember that arguably maybe for the rest of your life, because it's going to be deeply emotionally moving. It's going to release serotonin instead of just dopamine. And instead of just looking for dopamine like somebody with an appearance would do, it's trying to overcompensate quality with quantity. It's trying to get a lot of attention, a lot of superficial validation at the expense of individuality. Okay. So at the expense of individuality leads us to the next question, or the next idea in here. And with this image in mind, pertaining to this image, I want to talk about why wearing a mask is bad. Why is it detrimental? Why is imitation suicide? So first of all, it kills who you are. So to try to be anybody else in the world is a complete waste of the person you are. So I talked about earlier how every single individual on this planet is unique. We all have our own attributes and characteristics and input and conditioning, etc. We are a one-of-one equation. I've heard an old cliche. I always loved it though. It says you should be yourself because everybody else is taken. You can't be anybody else. You can't be anybody else than who you are. So I think that's what he means by imitation is suicide. And further, if we look at this image that Shrikant has provided in the text and also on the meetup page, he's provided a link. If we look at the image, I think the illustrator does a beautiful job at bringing some symbolic points to light here. What the illustrator does is, if you guys can't see the image, it's a person trying to put a mask on, but at the other side of the mask, like in other words, it's going into his face, there's like spikes that are presumably going to either injure or kill him. So if you look at this even deeper, the mask, it only has eye holes. So if you look at this symbolically and metaphorically for a second, what the eyes can do, they can only receive. The eyes can't produce. They are a receptive modality. I can only watch and observe and like take in. I can't produce anything. To produce something, I need a voice, or I need an outlet of action, right? I need a mouth. And this mask doesn't actually have a mouthpiece. So if you look at this even deeper of an application, it's not only suicide, but it's only going to lead to regression and lack of growth. Because to grow, you need to, one, be vulnerable, and express things and clarify. If anybody was on the podcast that we were talking about on how to apply ideas on 52 Living Ideas, we were talking about on Monday, Alex was saying, a member of the Switch podcast, Alex was saying that in order to make sense of this conceptual realm of thought, we can do one of two things. We can write or we can speak. So those are the two methodologies that we use as humans to, I guess, sublimate this ethereal, amorphous realm of thoughts and ideas, these weird things that we don't really know what they are until we can conceptualize them and capture them either in verbiage or in writing or in language. We use language as a tool. And if you have a mask on, you can't do this. So you can't make any sense of your thoughts. And furthermore, you can't express any of your thoughts. You can't express what makes you you. You can't express your individual colors, your individuality to the world. You can't explain to other people that might have had similar experiences as you have, and you're trying to give them guidance on how to go through them. You can't do that because you can't speak. You can only receive. So I think a good way to, I guess, find yourself or express yourself or fall in love with the idea or define the boundaries of what you believe the constituents of yourself would be is to create, okay? Create more than you consume. So this means articulating your philosophy. This means it could be in the form of writing. It could be in the form of art. It could be in the form of music. It could be in the form of simple conversation with people, sharing your ideas, sharing your insight, discussing, analyzing, digging deeper, inquiring about something that is particularly interesting to you. I think these are all tools that we use, but we cannot use these things with masks, because masks, just as portrayed in the image symbolically, you can only receive through the world. You're walking through the world and you are subject to everybody else's will that is producing. You are only receptive. And if you're receptive, one, you can't even make sense out of all these ideas because you can't formulate them into something that makes sense to you. You can't make them your own. You can't individualize them. And therefore, if you can't do those things, I would believe you would be relegated to the realm of an animal even, because there's no differentiation between you and all the other individual members of a species. Okay, what makes us unique as humans, we're not only obviously members of the same species, but we are all individual in the constituents of one species because of our experiences, because of our tools that we use to express ourselves, whether it be language or art or our career or our ideologies or our philosophies or our attitudes or our perspectives towards life. These are all tools we use to differentiate ourselves from baseline, I would say. And a life that is only lived on baseline is I would argue, not worth living, as Socrates says. The unexamined life is not worth living. So the individual with a mask who can't produce anything, that is an unexamined life. So if you can't speak, if you can't produce, there's no feedback, there's no criticism, you're not hit with any objection from the world, and you're not going to grow in that way because you're not vulnerable. So for me to operate in the world with only a mask and not creating anything, only consuming, that is a level of, I would say, arrogance, because it's assuming that all of the contents I have in my head are infallibly and incontrovertibly true. Okay. And I would not be able to test them because I'm not able to express them. And I believe we test the validity of our beliefs in the world through our action. So we act on what we believe to be true. And we meet in reality with opposition. We meet with other people who might say, no, that's incorrect. We meet with other natural laws, other natural forces. We can meet with opposing viewpoints or opposing new information that we receive from the external environment. And in this way, we are static. We are in flux, or we are not static. We are dynamic. We are in flux with the constant flow of eternal change in life. And I think we are living consistently with nature in this way because we're using our language. We're using tools to express our philosophy through. And if it's correct, cool, then we extrapolate. If it's incorrect, then we correct course, and we can improve our lives moving forward. But we can only do that if we have these tools. If we wear a mask, if we are imitating somebody else, if we are proposing a, I guess, fabricated or contrived reality, whatever you would define as a mask, if we are doing this, it is a complete waste of the person we are, and we cannot actually grow. So once you symbolically put a mask on, from that moment, you immediately begin your pinnacle and then regression down to stagnation and down to regression and down to, I guess, decrepitude and chaos and lack of development. So I think inherently that is some of the most important words that I've actually heard from this entire essay, self-reliance. That's my major extraction from this entire essay was the first line there. There's a time in every man's education when he arrives at the conviction that envy is ignorance, imitation is suicide. So to be somebody else rather than who you are, to try to be somebody else, to contrive an identity, contrive an image. I think this is especially pertinent today with the age of social media, right? We can contrive an identity online. We can try to appear a certain way. We are not a certain way. This is a complete waste of who we are. And it's upholding a, I would say, compensatory philosophy that is masking, trying to hide either insecurity or weakness or lack of strength or lack of patience, lack of patience to prolong that social praise, which is I think a good, I wouldn't say good, I would say it's equivocal. It's an understandable motivation, right? Social praise, evolutionarily. But we should delay this, or we should also, I would say another interpretation can be to not place our, I guess, subjective sense of well-being on the admiration of the mob. So Epictetus says, your merits should not be outward facing. You cannot derive merit from an external source. That's what Epictetus, a Stoic philosopher, says. So I think that's a congruent point to end on. Again, to look at this dichotomy, for some things to keep in mind, I would say is first to delay this sense of praise, either from the external world, value quality of praise over quantity, right? If it's somebody that you love, and value their feedback, I think you can emphasize more quality of feedback by saying, I use those two compliments in the beginning. I'm proud of the person you become versus you look nice, right? You guys can obviously see the discrepancy here. The proud of the person you become. That's somebody who is not wearing a mask. That is somebody who is unapologetically themselves. So yeah, with all that said, I will pass this on to Shrikant. He's going to moderate some questions for Q&A, and we're going to break out into individual groups.
This was one of my favorite titles of the meetups that you've done so far. Imitation Is Suicide. So powerful. All right, so we've got a whole bunch of people lined up for questions. Folks, you can line up for questions by going ahead and typing exclamation mark, or putting exclamation mark followed by your question, or by raising your hand in Zoom. And then I'll call upon you in order to ask questions. We have 4 rules. First is raising your hand, asking to talk. Second is to keep on topic. Third is to be brief. And fourth is to be courteous. Feel free to disagree with anything, but do so courteously. All right, so with that, it's going to be Joe, Nari, Kingston, Wayne, and Dave next. Joe, go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you, John, for presenting tonight. It was awesome, as always. So is self-acceptance a guard against envy, in the sense that you can then appreciate other people as opposed to envy them?
So I would look at this, and I think how we see other people is always an extension of either what is or what we are recognizing in ourselves. So I think it's an inherent phenomenon of psychological projection. If I look at somebody who's successful, and let's say in a realm I want, they have a nice car, they have a nice house, whatever they want, whatever they have that I want, I can do one of 2 things. I can either get inspired, or I can become envious. I think inspiration would be the correct output there. And I think that's a reflection of a healthy attitude with myself toward my goals. And I think I think that would reflect that I believe I'm progressing toward that realm. And if I was jealous of them, I think that would inherently hold a subconscious belief that I know I'm not doing enough, or I know I'm not doing the correct things, or I'm trying to justify, I'm trying to justify my failure or my inadequacy. You see this all the time, and especially an emotionally, I guess, subjectively influencing areas such as money, right? It's a very emotional topic. When people will say somebody rich and they say, oh, they're evil, they probably scam somebody to get that money. Money's the root of all evil. They'll project all of their insecurities about their wealth and their beliefs on it toward that individual. They have no idea. I think there's a lot of psychological projection going on there, in short. So to the first part of the question, self-acceptance, I do think that is an inherent precedent. I think it's imperative if we are to look at people and be inspired objectively by their results, instead of subjectively imposing our beliefs on them on how they got those results, if that's a good answer to your question.
It is. Thank you.
Okay.
So next one is going to be Nari, followed by Kingston. Kingston had a question similar to Nari. So Nari gets to ask the question first, and then Kingston can ask a follow-up if he wants.
Okay.
Nari, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, John. Thanks for doing this. I missed this last week, so I'm happy to be back. My question is, how do you reconcile this idea that imitation is suicide with the idea of what we're taught is like one of the best methods for self-improvement, which is sort of like envisioning the future and kind of putting yourself into that role, kind of faking it until you make it, so that things become ingrained and become habit. For example, like if you're socially awkward, but you keep putting yourself in social situations so that you can kind of polish that skill, it's still a form of a mask, right? You're developing something that you're not comfortable with, but it becomes truth in the end. So how do you reconcile that idea?
Very good point. I would bring it back to the statistical interpretation I brought up earlier. So I said, like, you are 99.9% identical to your yesterday self, right? I would still say, like, even if I project myself 10 years in the future and I say, I want this career, I want to be making this type of money, I want to be this confident person, have these type of friendships and relationships, etc., and I don't have those things now, you could argue that's imitation, but I wouldn't argue it's imitation, because you spawned those ideas and those ideologies and those beliefs and desires from your current self. So in other words, they are completely congruent with who you are today. So I wouldn't even look at those as a discrepancy, because you created those things in your mind and in your ideal and in your practice. You didn't accept it. Now, on the other hand, if you were to externally accept somebody saying you should go do this career, you should have these things in your life, you should be an architect, you should do, like, if it's parental, I don't know, pressure to go to a certain college and be a certain profession, I would advise against that, because that's not congruent with your own intrinsic desires. You know, it's not going to bring you fulfillment as a person. So I would think there's a direct correlation to the degree it's designed by you. So if, like, this socially anxious person, if they truly want to be somebody who is outgoing and like extroverted and fun loving and all these things, I would say if they designed that and they wrote it down on paper, and that's exactly what they want from their current self, from their deepest part of themselves subconsciously, I wouldn't even look at that as imitation. I would look at that as the natural progression toward this future ideal.
Okay, Kingston, you get to ask a follow-up question.
Yeah, I had the same question. Thanks first of all for speaking. You always get inspired on seeing somebody. Because I won't say that it's jealous. It's just getting inspired and motivated. So if I want to be that type of successful, why not I can think like I can follow that person's steps. I can follow what he did, because he already achieved and he succeeded. So why not I can imitate myself to attain that status?
Okay. John, do you want me to repeat his essential question? You got it?
Yeah. The general
Okay.
gist of it. You want to follow in somebody's footsteps who inspires you. Is that kind of the general?
That's right. Yep.
Okay. I wouldn't see anything wrong with that. If you compartmentalize their life into, and you look at only specifically the area that you want to follow them in. So let's say it's, I don't know, just money or just relationships or just their job. They're really good at being an engineer or a software designer, and you're in the same profession and you want to do those things. You can emulate, but I don't think it would be wearing a mask. You can ask them their principles. You can ask them their routines, their way of living, their philosophies, their identities, their I guess insights and information and wisdom they've accrued from over the years. I wouldn't say like this whole path of like imitation is suicide doesn't mean you can't extract information from other people. On the contrary, I think you should extract information from as many wide sources as you can get your hands on, in terms of how it relates to all of these. Like, you're looking at your life like a puzzle piece. You say, okay, I want my career in order over here. Here's people that I want to emulate the results. I'm going to put that in here. Here's people that I want to emulate in physique and health. I don't see anything wrong with that. I don't think that's imitation. I would say imitation is more so like fabricating an identity and trying to become that person to achieve the results that they have without putting in the work that they have. That might be maybe a different interpretation of imitation. But I don't see anything wrong with like getting inspired by and following in people's footsteps if it's like objective principles and doing the same, I guess, methodology that they use, as long as you make it yours and as long as you believe it's going to be right for you and it's going to get you the correct results that you want. I would say more power to you.
Thanks, John. Next up are going to be Wayne, Dave, Daniel, and Deborah with the H. So Wayne, go ahead.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. So my question is, like, what are some markers? Let's say I believe that, yes, I don't want to imitate and wear a mask, but sometimes you can do this unwittingly. So I'm wondering, what are some markers that you can use to identify when you are unwittingly imitating and wearing a mask? I think one of them is that sometimes you want to check your feelings, like you're feeling inspiration versus envy. That's one way to check whether or not you're being authentic. But I'm wondering, are there any other markers that you have used or that you would use?
Okay, that's a very good question. I did not even anticipate that one. So one would be, that's a brilliant one that you brought up, like checking your emotions in terms of inspiration or envy. I mean, personally, autobiographically, I have frequent, like, what would you say, check-ins with myself. I spend a lot of time in solitude and meditation and introspection. I journal a lot of my beliefs and my actions. And I also what would you say, like establish my ideal multiple times a year. So I say, like, what's my ideal life? I write that down multiple times a year. So I know I'm not just like blindly following the crowd or something like that. I mean, I don't know if I would say like in the moment I would have an indicator. I don't know that I'd have a concise answer for that right now, but I mean, I think it's could be a very fruitful line of philosophical inquiry. I'm very interested in talking like that. Maybe we can talk about that in a breakout group or something like that. But that's a very good idea.
Next up is Dave.
Thanks, Shrikant, and thanks for bringing this up, John. Back to the mask for a second. When I first looked at it, the spikes were so powerful that was the only thing I absorbed. And I appreciate your observation that there were eye holes. But then when I looked at it again, the person's eyes are closed. So I took your thought that, you know, there would be receiving but not transmitting. But if his eyes are closed, he wouldn't even be receiving anything. So I thought, you know, first he wanted to see the world through the other person's eyes. But if eyes are closed, it seemed like he just wants to be the other person, even giving up his self. But want to thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good insight. I personally looked at it as, I looked at his countenance as rather blissful. It looks like he's like in pleasure to put this on. And that's where I got the idea of social validation being a pleasure. Because right when you put that mask on, you're immediately affirmed. You immediately get attention. You get gratification. You get this emotional release of like, hey, you look good. Or hey, like that, you externally look like you're doing something virtuous or noble or benevolent, etc. And I think that act of praise is what that countenance was indicative of, in my opinion. But that is a very good insight. I do like that, though.
Okay, next up is Alex, Daniel, Deborah, Aaron, and Jackie. Alex, go ahead.
Hey, John. So I just kind of wanted to bring up that it seems like wearing a mask could be a function of society, whereas here in the US, we're very kind of focused on independence and individualism, whereas in other societies, they're more kind of collectivistic in nature, and they really kind of value that conformity, you know, and supporting society. So in a way, wouldn't you kind of consider that suicide could be subjective in societal values? And I mean, the other thing that I kind of think of too is that it could be some priorities for individuals, like what's important to them, like having a family would be more important than pursuing a career or pursuing anything else. So it's important to kind of conform in that way because that's what's important to them.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of like, I would say like context and nuance with definitions of a lot of things, with definitions of conformity, with definitions of like imitation, with definitions of what a mask could be, with definitions in the validity and utility of a mask. But I'm more so talking about like the whole general theme, which I hold like in this, I guess, presentation, like as a contemptuous attitude toward, is trying to be somebody you're not, just to appeal for social validation. So social validation at the expense of individuality. That's what I'm holding a contemptuous attitude toward. I do understand, like you're talking about, the validity and utility in conforming sometimes. I mean, I brought up earlier the book called Social. It's evolutionarily wired in us to conform, you could argue, with perfect merit. So I do understand that. It's difficult to be shunned. It's difficult to be isolated or exiled or be labeled as this nonconformist, or to not have praise or any of these things. I understand these are significantly psychologically detrimental. So there is a lot of context, there is a lot of nuances, but I would say unequivocally, trying to appeal social validation at the expense of self is deserving of contempt. That's my idea.
John, I want to do one thing. Dave had some interesting observations, kind of original observations about the picture. Mm-hmm. How about, I'm going to ask everybody to just type in whatever they got from the picture, whatever kind of stood out. Just go ahead and type in the chat. And John, you can read it out, see what let's see what people are saying. When you look at the picture, what impressions did you get? What stood out?
Portrayal. Tension rods. A lot of them, ignorance is bliss. That's a good one. Ouch. I actually had one a little bit like more of what would you call it? Like a reach, I guess. I'll explain a little bit after we look through all of these spikes. Pain,
Needles in the face, blood flow, spikes, pain. Putting a mask is an addiction to hurt and pleasure. The spikes will go into his brain, so it stops thinking. Horror, pain. Masking is death. When I assume other identity, my identity is killed. The dichotomy of looking forward to putting on the mask. Just a second.
It doesn't cover his ears. That's a good point. I didn't even see that. That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Was that? I mean, ears are receptive.
Putting on the mask yet is painful at the same time.
Ears are receptive, just like eyes. So,
how do I look like now? Serenity doesn't cover his ears. Back and forth goes both direction. Intention rods. The nails in the face. The pain of denying one's true self. Torture. Man in the mask. Oh, that was nice. Very nice. Freeing, real. Willingness to suffer in order to fit in. All right, that was great. All right, so let's continue with the questions. It's going to be Daniel, Deborah, Aaron, Jackie, and Jewel. Daniel, go ahead.
Hi, John. Just wondering, how do we get rid of, oh my gosh, let me just start the video. How do we get rid of our mask and to accept ourselves if we really don't like ourselves very much? And there's something in us that wants to hide from other people.
So that's multi-layered in itself, but I think one modality that I brought it up in the early form of the presentation is to simply, I would say, use these tools of language and expression and conversation and writing and in short, creating, rather than just blindly consuming all of the time. Because if you look at the dominant narrative of society, of other people, it is detrimental. Okay, the dominant narrative of the hundreds of advertisements we see every day are what? You're not enough, you're not pretty enough, you're not skinny enough, you're not rich enough, you're not this enough, you need this, you need that, you lack this, you lack that. All of them are detrimental, and I would say about 97% of them are detrimental in nature. We receive so little encouragement for who we are because nobody can profit off of that except us. So for other people to exploit us, they have to say we are incomplete, we lack this, we lack that. So I would say, first of all, to shut out all of that noise, instead of just consuming all of the time, start to turn that polarity and then create. So create, and then what we do in the process of creating, not creation for creation's sake, but to articulate our philosophy and also to find what makes us most fulfilled and meaningful. So create also in terms of, instead of, here's one practical example, instead of investing into things and possessions, start investing your time, money, and resources into experiences, because experiences shape who we are and allow us to find and narrow down and specify what makes us most fulfilled, what makes us most passionate, what elicits the most pride and growth and joy and serotonin off of what experience. And we can begin to notice patterns, and we can fill our life with those patterns. And we can also, in this experimentation of experiences and shutting out our input, we can also take mental note of tracking our life in terms of what is draining for us, what is most detrimental, what is significantly destructive in nature. And we can jettison and dispense with a lot of those influences in our life as well.
Next up is Deborah with the H.
Hi. Okay, so I really liked the underlying message, but I wonder if it's kind of like universally applicable or like practical for all people. Like, what if you, this is sort of like what Alex was saying, but I feel like a step further, because like, what if you live in a society where it's like legitimately dangerous to rebel or like not conform, or if you don't have the same privileges that like Emerson had? So like someone who had all of those privileges that he had, like racially, like class-wise, like a certain comfort education, but was a woman at that time, let's say. So like, I don't know like what you do. Like, I guess you could try to work within like a small framework, but like, yeah, like what do you, I don't know if it's going to apply to everybody in that same sense.
Right. I mean, that is a very good point. And that goes back to the point I was talking about with like, there's a lot of context and nuance and like definition of conformity. Like I said earlier, I do see like some instances there is perfect utility, and even advantage in conforming. One could argue sometimes, sure. So again, I think there is a lot of context and nuance. I don't know that it would be able to be applied at a universal scale. Like you said, I'm kind of with you on that. I don't really know. I was just looking at this in terms of like my own eyes, and like when I see people like that are really successful, do I get envious? Do I get bitter? Do I get inspired? And like trying to like isolate that. And like I was really ruminating on this quote for a very long time before I like was able to connect it with all this other stuff and connect it to this image. But I try to hold it as a general principle over my life. Like always be who I am. Don't be afraid to like share my voice at the expense of being exiled or being embarrassed or being criticized. You know what I mean? Like it's who I was. That's fine. I have more pride in that because it's affirmation of myself than I would have pride in external validation from like surface level numbers of the mob. You know what I mean? Like, yes, that's also appealing, but like short term.
Okay. Next up is Aaron. Aaron, go ahead.
Great presentation as always, John. I was wondering, like, if this is an all or nothing thing. And the example I'm going to give you is, let's say you have a job and you generally like your job. You feel like it's an expression of who you are, but that job has a dress code or they have certain rules or norms that you have to follow. How much are you willing to betray of yourself without wearing a mask, but you are still not like a traitor to who you are, but you're still conforming to like wearing the dress code or showing up on time or following the norms of the office?
Yeah. I would say that's contingent upon your hierarchy of values, because you're looking at your career in terms of what does it bring you? What do you extract from your career? And you can make the argument, okay, income, security, you pay your bills, you make your living off this, you feed yourself, you get a sense of pride, you get a sense of status and hierarchy, you can provide for people that you love. Okay, all of those benefits from that career. So in other words, that is like at the peak of your hierarchy. Whereas like, okay, being a like rebellious nonconformist and like wearing what you want, it's like, what's the maximum result you can get from that? Probably not much, right? Like you get a little bit of pride, or like you can express your individuality a little bit, but like the result off of that, that's probably way lower in your hierarchy. Yes, it still might be a value for you, but you're going to sacrifice that small compensation for that value at the expense of a much larger compensation overall, I would say.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. Next up is Jackie. Jackie, go ahead.
John, do you have, what's your consideration about the unconscious and people kind of being in a fog, and then suddenly they kind of wake up and they say, oh my God, I've been false to myself. Do you have any thoughts? Did you consider that? I know this is not Emerson's thoughts, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think he addresses this sort of in the preceding paragraph where he said, in works of genius, we recognize our own rejected thoughts. In the succeeding statement to that, he says, they come back to us with an alienated majesty, he says. So I think that's really interesting, because we could go through life blindly, just reacting and conforming and just being resentful toward people that have results based off their hard work and effort and sacrifice, or we could get inspired. And I think that transition between being bitter, being resentful, being reactive, and then being inspired, I would say that's the transition from the unconscious compensatory reactive state into the conscious, enlightened, illuminated life. Looking at things and then designing your life based off of like the external input that you have. So I would say a person that is entirely unconscious has no knowledge of self, as Socrates would say, the unexamined life is not worth living. Also, you brought up unconscious, as Jung would say, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Okay, there's no such thing as fate. We all choose our own individual thoughts. Some of us do them unconsciously. Some of them do that involuntarily based off of our environmental stimulus and input. And I think that way is very dangerous to live through proximity, because as I mentioned with advertising earlier, there's so much information out there that is detrimental, that is just noise, that is destructive, that doesn't have our best interest in mind, or that it's not really constructive or deconstructive. It's a distraction, right? We're just going to be running in circles all over the place if we just follow everything blindly. So I think the entirely unconscious life is very dangerous. And I think the way to mitigate that would just be like a lot of introspection, a lot of awareness of pain. And like applying your suffering and applying your emotional reactions and judgments and exiles and being embarrassed, all of these negative detrimental emotions and states, applying those toward an end and not just looking over them blindly.
Okay, next question is from Jewel. Her mic is not working, so I'm going to read it out for you. Could social praise be something physical, that brain wiring, not personality or weakness? Lens 1-2. Research reveals that dopamine is released with social praise. Someone low in dopamine could be more in need of social praise as a result, as opposed to someone with a more regulated with respect to dopamine. What do you think?
Okay, I'm reading it now. I'm not really sure the question there. Could it be something physical?
I'm sending it out again.
Yeah, I see it. I see it in the chat. Could it be something physical? I mean, it could be an argument, there. I mean, neurologically, researchers conclude that more dopamine is actually released in the anticipation of something than the actual event itself. But regardless, I mean, if it's just a neurological chemical argument, I don't know that social validation is the only methodology and avenue to get dopamine, right? Like there's plenty of other ways, like from actualizing your goals, from checking off your to-do list, from exercise, releasing endorphins, releasing brain-derived neurotropic factor. There's a bunch of other methodologies and expressions. So I wouldn't justify blindly adhering to the mass crowd for sense of dopamine release, even though it might be more necessary in other people.
Okay, I think Tatiana has a short comment. Tatiana, go ahead. You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, we were talking about self as an idea, that there is a self, and I'm just wondering if you have any comments about the idea that a self may not be such a solid thing, that it may, depending on Eastern or Western understanding of the word, of the notion of self, you might not strive to have one in general. That's my comment. Thank you.
I mean, yeah, there's a lot of I guess areas for interpretation here. I'm just simply talking about in the pragmatic reality in terms of like our quantifiable and metricized goals if we want in our life. So we do live in a tangible reality. We do live we do exist in this current three-dimensional world. I understand there's differentiation in value structures in terms of like our philosophies, in terms of what we identify with, but we do at the end of the day, again, exist in this tangible reality. And in terms of this tangible reality, we can choose a profession, we can choose a vocation, we can choose a calling, we can choose to emulate an ideal, we can choose to design our life and all of our circumstances. And in doing so, I think that is the most authentic way of existing. And you don't even have to like superimpose the phrase, the linguistic phrase of self onto this. You could just say you are that which is existing and expanding and expressing itself through the tools that you have at your disposal at any given time. You can make a metaphorical argument there as well. But regardless, I do think there is a distinction between being something that you are not, or fabricating an image or fabricating a reality or existing in a manner that is not conducive to who or what you believe yourself to be deep down.
Okay, last question is going to be by Christine, and then we are going to go to the breakout rooms for about 25 minutes, after which we are going to come back and each person will get to share their takeaway from the meetup and the breakout room discussion. So Christine, go ahead.
Yes, hi John, hi everybody. I was just thinking about who's controlling the mask. Obviously in this image there are spikes in it, but if the mask is controlling you or you're controlling the mask, in other words, staying off the radar or using it in some way, to, get where you want to go, to get to maybe even a better place, knowing that you have to go through this area that you have to conform to, which brings up the second part of the question, which is conforming versus cooperation.
Could you summarize the question?
Sure. Yeah, so there's a difference between, I guess I was just wondering if you saw a difference between conforming versus cooperation. So one is you're putting on the mask to cooperate for a little while versus it getting, you know, something that is becoming a part of you, that you're forgetting who you really are.
So my answer would be kind of congruent to the answer that I had for Aaron's question. He was talking about like hierarchy of values, and like, yes, you might have to sacrifice this small area of your life at the expense of something larger. So you might have to conform, you might have to cooperate a little bit, you know, in a transitory phase of your life in order to get to the other side that you want that is more valuable. Now, I think the distinction might be here is like, if you don't know what's on the other side, and you're putting this mask on out of social acceptance or out of somebody tells you to do it, or you fear people judging you for not having a mask on, not looking the same as all of them, I would say that's blind conformity. That's not cooperation. I would say cooperation might be something like the answer to Aaron's question. You do this at the expense of a greater value on the other side of this like transitory phase, and is all of it, and it's contingent upon this phase being transitory as well. So that's kind of how I would look at that distinction here.
Got it. Thank you.
Right, folks. So now, John, do you want to read out the 3 questions that you want people to discuss during the breakout groups?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, we're going to break out into small groups of 5 or 6 each, and we're going to facilitate discussion around these 3 questions. The first is, what do you guys believe is the source of envy or jealousy? Being jealous of somebody. What do you think that stems from? Why do you think we experience that? Second question is, how do we fall, and what are some practical things we can do to fall in love with who we are today, who we are right now? How can we fall in love with ourselves? And the third question, so if Emerson says envy is ignorance, what can we do, or what can we learn, do you guys think, to get rid of envy, to get rid of this jealousy or this destructive emotion? What can we learn? What can we do to get rid of that? So source of jealousy, how to fall in love with ourselves, and what should we learn to get rid of jealousy?
All right. Give me just a second. I'm going to cut and paste this into the chat. And folks, if you could just cut and paste this so that you will have these questions handy. What I recommend is that once go ahead and cut and paste this right now. And when you go to the chat, just post it in the chat over there. So that will serve as a reference. Okay, I'm creating the rooms for about 21 minutes or so. And after 21 minutes of discussion, we'll end up back here, and then we'll get to share our takeaways. Opening the rooms now.